The shadow of the weeping willow danced across Beatrice Sutton's face as tears streamed silently down her cheeks, each droplet carrying the weight of 1,000 memories. The year was 1875, and the harsh Montana territory had already taken everything from her, or so she believed, until the stranger's shadow fell across her own. Blood-red sunlight bathed the cemetery on the outskirts of Riverstone, as Beatrice knelt before the freshly turned soil. 3 months had passed since influenza had claimed her husband Thomas, yet the raw ache in her chest felt as fresh as the day he'd drawn his final breath. At 26, she had become something of a ghost herself in the small frontier town, existing but barely living, drifting through days that blurred together in a haze of grief. "I brought your favorite wildflowers," she whispered to the wooden cross, her fingers trembling as she arranged the small bouquet. "The blue ones, you said, reminded you of my eyes." The wind carried her words away, leaving nothing but silence in return. When the first sob escaped her lips, Beatrice didn't try to contain it. Here, alone with the dead, she could finally release the composure she maintained in town. The widow's black dress absorbed the dust as she curled into herself, shoulders shaking as grief overtook her once more. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps, didn't sense another presence until a shadow fell across the grave. Beatrice gasped, hastily wiping away tears with gloved hands as she turned to face the intruder. He stood tall against the setting sun, his features obscured by the broad brim of a worn leather hat. A stranger, not one of the townspeople who looked at her with that unbearable mixture of pity and discomfort. His duster bore the dust of long travels, and the gun at his hip spoke of a man accustomed to the wilderness. "Pardon the interruption, madam," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature. "Didn't mean to startle you." Beatrice straightened her back, attempting to reclaim her dignity. "I was just leaving," she replied, though they both knew it was a lie. The stranger stepped closer, and in the fading light, she could finally see his face weathered by sun and wind, but kind. Eyes the color of storm clouds studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I see you," he said simply, those 3 words hanging in the air between them. "Behind the brave face you show the town. I see you." Something in his voice, understanding without pity, broke through her carefully constructed walls. Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "And I choose you," he continued, extending a hand not in charity, but in something else entirely. "To share a meal with, if you'll allow it. No one should face the sunset alone." Beatrice stared at his outstretched hand, confusion and surprise momentarily overshadowing her grief. "I don't even know your name, sir." A small smile touched his lips. "Harrison Lawson, madam. Just arrived in Riverstone today, and you're the first soul I've felt compelled to speak with." She hesitated, propriety warring with the crushing loneliness that had been her only companion these past months. "Beatrice Sutton," she finally replied, but did not take his hand. "And I'm afraid I'm poor company, Mr. Lawson." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but I'd still be honored by yours." He withdrew his hand without offense. "The hotel mentioned a cafe still serving supper till sundown. Nothing fancy, but I've learned a hot meal tastes better when shared." The old Beatrice, the one who existed before grief had hollowed her out, would have refused outright. A widow dining with a stranger would set tongues wagging throughout Riverstone. But the woman she had become was too weary to care about such things. "Why?" she asked plainly. "Why choose me?" Harrison Lawson removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with the occasional silver strand. "Because I recognize something in your eyes, Mrs. Sutton. Something I've seen in my own reflection too many times." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Grief isn't something to be endured alone." Beatrice felt a flicker of something beyond the numbness, curiosity perhaps. This man spoke of loss as one who knew its contours intimately. "One meal," she conceded finally, rising to her feet and brushing the dirt from her skirts. "Though I warn you, conversation isn't my strength these days." "I reckon silence can say plenty too," Harrison replied, replacing his hat. He offered his arm, but maintained a respectful distance. "May I escort you to town?" Beatrice hesitated before placing her hand lightly on his forearm. The solid warmth beneath her fingers felt strangely steadying. As they walked away from the cemetery, she couldn't help glancing back at Thomas's grave, feeling something akin to guilt stirring within her. The walk to town passed mostly in silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence that usually accompanied Beatrice wherever she went. Harrison matched his stride to hers, occasionally commenting on the landscape or the approaching evening, requiring no response. By the time they reached Miller's Cafe, Beatrice had grown almost comfortable with his presence. The bell above the door announced their arrival, and as expected, several heads turned their way. Beatrice felt the familiar weight of stares, but was surprised when Harrison smoothly guided her to a corner table, his body positioned to shield her from prying eyes. "Folks tend to mind their business more when they think you don't notice them looking," he said quietly as he pulled out her chair. "You speak from experience," Beatrice observed, the first real thing she'd said to him. A shadow passed across his features. "Let's just say, I understand the burden of others' curiosity." Sarah Miller herself approached their table, eyebrows raised in silent question as she glanced between Beatrice and the stranger. "Evening, Mrs. Miller," Beatrice greeted, finding her voice. "This is Mr. Lawson. He's new to Riverstone." "Just arrived today," Harrison confirmed with a polite nod. "The stagecoach driver recommended your establishment highly." Sarah's expression softened somewhat. "Well, welcome to Riverstone, Mr. Lawson. We've got venison stew and fresh bread tonight. Coffee's hot, too." "That sounds perfect for both of us," Harrison replied, glancing at Beatrice for confirmation. She nodded slightly. When Sarah departed, Beatrice found herself studying the man across from her. In the lamplight, she could see the details she'd missed before: the small scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that spoke of someone who had once smiled easily, the calluses on his hands that told of work and hardship. "You're wondering what my business is in Riverstone," Harrison said, breaking into her thoughts. Beatrice felt a flush rise to her cheeks at being caught staring. "Among other things, I'm a horse trainer by trade, worked ranches across 4 territories, heard the Coleman spread outside town, was looking for someone to handle their new breeding stock." He shrugged slightly. "Seemed as good a place as any to stop for a while." "And how long is a while, Mr. Lawson?" Beatrice asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Harrison's gaze held hers steadily. "That depends on what I find here worth staying for." The weight of his words hung between them as Sarah returned with 2 bowls of steaming stew and a basket of bread. Beatrice busied herself with unfolding her napkin, grateful for the interruption. "So, you're planning to see Mr. Coleman tomorrow?" she asked once Sarah had gone, desperate to steer the conversation to safer ground. "That's the plan," Harrison confirmed, breaking a piece of bread. "What about you, Mrs. Sutton? Are you from Riverstone originally?" Beatrice shook her head. "Thomas, my husband and I came from Pennsylvania 5 years ago." He had dreams of building something in the West, a future. Her voice caught slightly. "We owned the Mercantile on Main Street." "And now?" Harrison asked gently. "Now I own it," Beatrice replied, the words still strange on her tongue. "Though I've been considering selling. Too many memories." Harrison nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Memories can be the heaviest burden to carry." "You speak like a man with his own share," Beatrice observed, surprising herself with her boldness. "Everyone out here is running from something or toward something," Harrison replied. "Sometimes both at once." "And which are you doing, Mr. Zays, Lawson?" The question hung between them as Harrison seemed to consider his answer carefully. "Maybe I've been running so long I've forgotten what I was heading toward," he finally said. "Until today." Beatrice felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest and quickly looked down at her bowl. "You shouldn't say such things to a woman you've just met." "Perhaps not," Harrison agreed, his voice softening. "But out here, life's too uncertain to waste time on pretenses. I saw a woman weeping alone today, trying to bear a weight too heavy for any one person, and something in me recognized something in you." "Grief," Beatrice said flatly. "Strength," Harrison countered. "The kind that keeps you standing when everything inside says to fall." Beatrice stared at him, wondering how this stranger could see what even those who had known her for years could not. The rest of their meal passed in conversation that gradually became less strained. Harrison speaking of the territories he'd traveled, Beatrice cautiously sharing small stories of her life in Riverstone. By the time they finished, night had fully descended outside. "May I walk you home, Mrs. Sutton?" Harrison asked as they stepped into the cool evening air. Beatrice hesitated only briefly before nodding. I live above the Mercantile. It's not far. They walked in companionable silence, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk. When they reached the storefront with Sutton's General Goods painted across the window, Beatrice paused at the side entrance that led to her living quarters. Thank you for the meal, Mr. Lawson, she said formally, though her voice held a warmth that had been absent for months. And for seeing me. Harrison removed his hat, holding it against his chest. Thank you for allowing me to, Mrs. Sutton. He hesitated, then added, I'd be honored if our paths could cross again. Beatrice found herself nodding before she could second-guess the decision. I opened the store at 8. Coffee's always on. A genuine smile spread across Harrison's face, transforming his features. Then I reckon I'll need supplies around 8 tomorrow. After he departed, Beatrice climbed the stairs to her empty rooms, surprising herself by lighting all the lamps instead of sitting in her usual darkness. For the first time in months, she felt a tiny spark of something that might, someday, resemble hope. Morning came with a clarity Beatrice hadn't experienced in months. She found herself taking extra care with her appearance, though she still wore her morning black. The familiar rituals of opening the store felt different somehow, as if she were more present in her own life than she had been since Thomas's passing. At precisely 8 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. Harrison Lawson stepped inside, hat in hand, looking as though he'd already been awake for hours. His clothes were clean, but practical a sign he intended to meet with Coleman about the job. Morning, Mrs. Sutton, he greeted, his deep voice filling the empty store. Hope I'm not too punctual. Beatrice felt a smile tugging at her lips. Punctuality is a virtue rarely seen in these parts, Mr. Lawson. Coffee's ready, as promised. She poured 2 cups, sliding one across the counter to him. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, causing Beatrice to withdraw her hand, perhaps too quickly. Did you sleep well? Harrison asked, taking a sip of the strong brew. Better than I have in some time, Beatrice admitted. And you? The hotel beds aren't known for their comfort, Harrison chuckled. I've slept under the stars more nights than not. Any roof feels luxurious after that. The door opened again, and Beatrice straightened as Mrs. Eleanor Porter entered. The older woman's eyebrows shot up at the sight of Harrison. Good morning, Beatrice, Eleanor said, her gaze darting between them. I didn't realize you had company. Mr. Lawson is new to town, Beatrice explained, feeling an irrational need to justify his presence. He's interviewing with Mr. Coleman today about the horse trainer position. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Is that so? Well, welcome to Riverstone, Mr. Lawson. The Colemans are good people to work for. So I've heard, madam, Harrison replied respectfully. I'm looking forward to meeting them. Eleanor nodded, then turned to Beatrice. I'll need a pound of sugar and some of that cinnamon that came in last week, dear. As Beatrice gathered the items, she was acutely aware of Harrison watching her movements. There was something both unsettling and comforting about his attentiveness. When Eleanor finally departed, after taking far longer than necessary to count her change, Beatrice released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I should probably be on my way as well, Harrison said, finishing his coffee. Coleman's expecting me at 9. Of course, Beatrice replied, trying to mask her disappointment. I wish you luck with the position. Harrison placed his hat on his head, but lingered at the counter. Mrs. Sutton, Beatrice, would you consider joining me for supper again tonight? If my meeting goes well, I'd like to celebrate, and if it doesn't, he smiled ruefully. I could use the company. Beatrice hesitated. One meal could be explained away as kindness to a newcomer. A second would invite speculation she wasn't sure she was ready to face. I close the store at 6, she found herself saying. But perhaps you could come here instead. I could cook something. Harrison's expression brightened. I'd like that very much. And I promised to bring something to contribute. After he left, Beatrice found herself moving through the day with a lightness she'd forgotten was possible. Several customers commented on the change in her demeanor, though none dared to ask directly about the stranger seen taking coffee with her that morning. By 5:30, the store was empty, and Beatrice began the closing routine with unusual eagerness. She had just counted the till when the bell announced a customer. Looking up, She felt her heart sink at the sight of Margaret Coleman, wife of the ranch owner Harrison had gone to meet. "Mrs. Coleman," Beatrice greeted, forcing a smile. "How may I help you this evening?" Margaret approached the counter, her expression unreadable. "I thought you might like to know that we hired that cowboy who came to see William today, Harrison Lawson." Beatrice tried to keep her expression neutral. "That's wonderful news. I'm sure he'll be an asset to your ranch." Margaret studied her for a moment. "He mentioned he'd met you yesterday, said you were kind enough to share a meal with him." "He seemed new and alone," Beatrice explained. "It was nothing more than basic hospitality." "Of course," Margaret nodded, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. William was quite impressed with his knowledge of horses. Apparently, he worked with some famous breeders back east. Beatrice felt a flash of surprise. Harrison hadn't mentioned that. "I'm glad it worked out." Margaret turned to leave, but paused at the door. "He's staying in the cabin by our north pasture. It's a fair ride from town." Her implication was clear. Harrison wouldn't be dropping by Riverstone casually anymore. After Margaret left, Beatrice closed the store and climbed the stairs to her rooms, fighting a wave of disappointment. Of course Harrison would stay at the ranch, most hands did. It was foolish to think he'd ride all the way to town just for supper with a widow he barely knew. She had just changed out of her store clothes when a knock sounded at her door. Heart racing, Beatrice hurried downstairs, pausing to check her appearance in the small mirror by the entrance before opening the door. Harrison stood on her doorstep, hat in hand, a cloth-covered basket in the other. Behind him, a handsome chestnut horse was hitched to the post. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Beatrice admitted, stepping aside to let him enter. "I gave my word," Harrison replied simply. "And I brought a peace offering, Mrs. Coleman insisted I take some of her preserves when she heard I was coming to town." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Coleman was here not 30 minutes ago. She mentioned you'd be staying at the ranch." Harrison hung his hat on the hook by the door, a gesture so domestic it made Beatrice's breath catch. "I am, but Coleman's giving me Sundays off and evenings as I please, so long as the horses are tended." "And you chose to ride all the way back to town this evening?" Beatrice asked, leading him up the stairs to her living quarters. Harrison followed, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. "Some journeys are worth making, Mrs. Sutton." The small apartment above the store was modest but comfortable. Thomas had built most of the furniture himself. A dining table with 4 chairs, a settee by the window, a bookcase filled with the novels Beatrice treasured. The kitchen was separated from the living area by a curtain, beyond which lay the bedroom. "It's not much," Beatrice said, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of her home. "It's perfect," Harrison replied, his gaze taking in the details that made the space hers. The crocheted throw over the settee, the dried wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, the well-loved books. Beatrice busied herself in the kitchen, grateful for something to do with her hands. "I have a stew simmering, nothing fancy." After years of campfire cooking, anything homemade tastes like a feast, Harrison assured her, setting the basket of preserves on the table. "Can I help?" Together they worked in the small kitchen, moving around each other with surprising ease. Harrison sliced bread, while Beatrice stirred the stew, and for a moment, the domesticity of it all made her chest ache with both grief and something newer possibility. Over supper, Harrison told her about his meeting with Coleman. He has some fine horses, but he needs someone who understands bloodlines and training. His last trainer was more cowhand than horseman. "And you're both?" Beatrice asked, genuinely curious. Harrison smiled. "I'm a horseman who can handle cowhand work when needed. Started working with horses when I was just a boy in Virginia. My father bred carriage horses for wealthy families back east." "Virginia," Beatrice repeated. "You're a long way from home." Something shadowed Harrison's expression. "Home stopped being a place for me a long time ago." Beatrice recognized the careful deflection she'd employed, similar tactics when people asked too many questions about her past. "Well, the Colemans are fortunate to have found someone with your experience." "And I'm fortunate they were hiring," Harrison replied. "Gives me reason to stay in Riverstone." The implication hung between them, neither acknowledging nor dismissing it. After they finished eating, Beatrice poured coffee, and they moved to sit by the window overlooking the darkened main street. "May I ask about your husband?" Harrison said softly. Only if you wish to speak of him. The question would have sent Beatrice retreating into silence months ago, but tonight she found herself wanting to share. Thomas was a dreamer. He believed the West held unlimited possibilities. She smiled sadly. We met in Philadelphia. I was working in my father's bookshop, and Thomas came in looking for maps of the territories. Harrison listened intently as she spoke of their courtship, their journey west, and the life they'd built in Riverstone. He sounds like a good man, he said when she finished. He was, Beatrice agreed. The influenza took him so quickly. 3 days from first symptoms to... She couldn't complete the sentence. Harrison's hand covered hers, where it rested on the settee between them. I'm sorry, Beatrice. The warmth of his touch and the sound of her given name on his lips unlocked something in her chest. The hardest part is feeling like I failed him, she confessed. All his dreams for this place, for our future. Sometimes I think I should sell the store, go back east to my family. Other times, that feels like betraying everything we built. What would you want if Thomas had never entered your life? Harrison asked gently. What dreams were yours alone? The question startled Beatrice. No one had asked about her dreams since Thomas died, only about her plans, her needs, her grief. I always loved books, she said slowly. Back in Philadelphia, I dreamed of opening a proper bookshop someday. Out here, that seemed impractical. Why? Harrison pressed. Seems to me frontier towns need books more than most places. Windows to worlds beyond these mountains. Beatrice felt a spark of the old excitement she used to feel when discussing such possibilities with Thomas. The Mercantile already carries a few books, but nothing substantial. I've thought about expanding that section. Then perhaps that's where you start, Harrison suggested. Not abandoning what you and Thomas built, but growing it in your own direction. They talked until the clock on the mantel chimed 10, Harrison sharing stories of his travels, Beatrice gradually revealing more of herself than she had to anyone in months. When he finally rose to leave, Beatrice felt reluctant to end the evening. At the door, Harrison turned to her. Thank you for tonight, Beatrice, for the meal and the company. Will I see you again? She asked, the question slipping out before she could consider its propriety. Harrison's smile reached his eyes. I need to settle in at the ranch for a few days, but I'd like to ride into town Sunday if that's agreeable. Perhaps we could attend church together. The prospect of appearing publicly alongside Harrison sent a flutter of both anxiety and anticipation through Beatrice. Sunday services were where the entire town gathered, where everyone would see them together. Yes, she heard herself say. I'd like that. Harrison's expression softened as he reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather-light, but Beatrice felt it like a brand against her skin. Until Sunday, then, he said, his voice low. After he left, Beatrice stood at the window, watching as he mounted his horse and rode down the darkened street. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt fully present in her own life, and terrified by the implications of that feeling. The days until Sunday stretched before her like an eternity and passed like seconds. Beatrice found herself paying more attention to the world around her, noticing the first wildflowers pushing through the soil in the town's small park, listening to the laughter of children playing outside the schoolhouse, feeling the warmth of spring sunshine on her face as she walked to the cemetery to tell Thomas about the strange awakening happening within her. I feel as though I'm betraying you, she whispered to the wooden cross. But I also feel as though I'm finding parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. The wind rustled through the new grass, and Beatrice imagined Thomas would have wanted her to live fully, not just exist in his shadow. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Beatrice dressed with care, still in her black mourning clothes, but allowing herself a cameo brooch Thomas had given her on their first anniversary. She was arranging her hair when a knock sounded downstairs. Harrison stood on her doorstep in a clean white shirt and dark waistcoat, his usual duster replaced by a proper jacket. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, looking every inch the respectable horseman rather than the travel-worn cowboy who'd first approached her in the cemetery. You look beautiful, he said simply, offering his arm. They walked to the small white church at the end of Main Street, Beatrice acutely aware of the glances and whispers that followed them. By the time they reached the church steps, She was gripping Harrison's arm so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "We can turn around," he murmured. "Go somewhere else?" Beatrice took a deep breath and shook her head. "No, I've hidden from life long enough." Inside, they sat in a pew near the back, Harrison's solid presence beside her, a comfort against the curious stares. Reverend Walsh's sermon was about renewal and second chances so pointed that Beatrice wondered if Margaret Coleman had spoken with him. After the service, there was no avoiding the social interactions that always followed. Margaret Coleman approached first, her husband William at her side. "Mrs. Sutton, lovely to see you," Margaret greeted, her gaze sliding to Harrison. "And Mr. Lawson, I see you found your way to town, despite the distance." "Some journeys are worth making, Mrs. Coleman," Harrison replied, echoing his words to Beatrice. "Your husband has been most generous with my time." William Coleman, a burly man with a shock of white hair, nodded approvingly. "Any man who works as hard as Lawson has this week deserves a day of rest. Those horses already respond to him better than they did to Jenkins after a year." The conversation continued, others from the congregation joining their circle. Harrison remained at Beatrice's side, his hand occasionally brushing hers in silent support. When Eleanor Porter made a thinly veiled comment about appropriate mourning periods, Harrison smoothly changed the subject to the spring planting, his gentle but firm redirection making Beatrice's heart swell with gratitude. After church, they walked to the small cafe for Sunday dinner, Harrison seemingly unbothered by the attention they attracted. As they ate, he spoke of his week at the Coleman Ranch, his eyes lighting up when describing the horses in his care. "There's a mare there, a beautiful bay with a white blaze, who reminds me of the first horse I ever trained," he told Beatrice. "Intelligent eyes, cautious but willing to trust if you're patient enough." "You speak of horses as if they're people," Beatrice observed, smiling. "Better than people in many ways," Harrison replied with a wink. "More honest about their intentions." After their meal, Harrison suggested a walk by the creek that ran behind the town. The path was quiet, away from prying eyes, allowing Beatrice to relax for the first time that day. "Thank you for enduring all that," she said, as they found a fallen log to sit on, the water burbling peacefully before them. "The stares, the questions," Harrison shrugged. "Small towns run on gossip. Give them a few weeks and they'll find something more interesting to talk about." "And in the meantime?" Beatrice asked, her question loaded with unspoken meaning. Harrison turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "In the meantime, I'd like to continue seeing you, Beatrice, if that's what you want too." Beatrice looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring unconsciously. "I never expected to feel this way again," she admitted softly. "It's frightening." "For me too," Harrison confessed, surprising her. "I haven't allowed myself to care about anyone in a very long time." "Why?" Beatrice asked, sensing there was much he still hadn't told her about his past. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. "I was married once," he finally said. "Her name was Catherine. We were young, barely more than children ourselves when we wed." Beatrice held her breath, afraid to interrupt this rare glimpse into his history. "We had a son," Harrison continued, his voice low. "Henry, he was 3 when the fever took them both. It swept through our town in Virginia just after the war." His hands clenched into fists. "I was away, breaking horses on a neighboring farm. By the time I returned, they were already in the ground." "Harrison," Beatrice whispered, her heart breaking for him. "I'm so sorry." "I couldn't stay there," he said, the pain still evident in his voice after all these years. "Every street, every building held memories. So I headed west, worked my way across the country, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Until now." Beatrice reached for his hand, uncurling his fingers and lacing them with her own. "Until now," she repeated. Harrison's eyes, when they met hers, held a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "I see you, Beatrice Sutton, behind the grief and the brave face. I see a woman of remarkable strength and gentle heart. And I choose you not out of pity or convenience, but because something in me recognized something in you from the first moment." Beatrice felt tears welling in her eyes, but for once, they weren't tears of grief. "I'm still wearing black," she whispered, "still mourning." Mourning doesn't have a timeline, Harrison said gently, and finding new joy doesn't diminish what you shared with Thomas. In that moment, sitting by the creek with her hand in Harrison's, Beatrice felt a shift inside her, as if a door long shut had opened just a crack, letting in a beam of light. "I'd like to continue seeing you too," she finally said, but slowly. "I'm still finding my way back to myself." Harrison lifted their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "We have time, Beatrice, all the time we need." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that gradually became the new structure of Beatrice's life. Harrison rode into town every Sunday, accompanying her to church and spending the day in her company. Occasionally, he would appear on a weekday evening, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he'd found in the Coleman library that he thought she'd enjoy, wildflowers gathered from the meadows he rode through, once a beautiful leather journal he'd purchased from a traveling salesman. Spring blossomed into summer, and with each passing day, Beatrice felt herself coming more fully alive. She began implementing changes at the store, expanding the book section, as she'd discussed with Harrison, ordering titles that reflected her own tastes rather than just the practical manuals and occasional novels Thomas had stocked. The townspeople gradually adjusted to seeing Beatrice and Harrison together. Some, like Eleanor Porter, maintained disapproving glances, but most seemed to accept the friendship developing between the widow and the horseman. Margaret Coleman became something of an unexpected ally, often stopping by the store to share news of Harrison's work at the ranch when he couldn't make it to town himself. "He's transforming that north pasture," Margaret told Beatrice one warm July afternoon. "William says he's never seen horses respond so well to a trainer's methods." Beatrice smiled, pride warming her chest. "He has a gift for understanding them." Margaret's knowing look made Beatrice blush slightly. "Not just horses, it seems," the older woman observed. "You're looking well these days, Beatrice. There's color in your cheeks again." It was true. The woman who stared back at Beatrice from her mirror each morning looked increasingly different from the hollow-eyed widow who had knelt weeping in the cemetery months ago. She had even begun wearing colors again, muted purples and blues that felt like a tentative step away from the stark black of deep mourning. On a particularly beautiful Sunday in late July, Harrison suggested they pack a picnic and ride to a spot he'd discovered while exploring the area around the Coleman Ranch. "It's a bit of a journey," he warned as he helped Beatrice mount the gentle mare he'd brought for her, "but I promise it's worth it." They rode for nearly 2 hours, leaving the familiar landscape around Riverstone behind and climbing into the foothills. Harrison led them along trails that wound through pine forests and across meadows bursting with wildflowers until they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley below. "Oh," Beatrice breathed as she dismounted, taking in the spectacular view. The town of Riverstone was visible in the distance, a tiny collection of buildings nestled in the vast wilderness, with mountains rising majestically beyond. "I found this place my first week at Coleman's," Harrison said, spreading a blanket on the grass. "I've been wanting to share it with you ever since." They ate the simple meal Beatrice had prepared, cold chicken, bread, cheese, and apple tarts, talking easily about everything and nothing. Afterward, they sat side by side, shoulders touching as they gazed out at the view. "I've been thinking," Harrison said after a comfortable silence. "Coleman offered to make my position permanent, with a raise and the cabin as part of my wages." Beatrice turned to look at him, heart quickening. "That's wonderful, Harrison. You've certainly earned it." "It would mean staying in Riverstone," he continued, his eyes searching hers. "Putting down roots." "And is that what you want?" Beatrice asked softly. Harrison reached for her hand, his touch now familiar and cherished. "I haven't wanted to stay anywhere in 12 years, he said. "Not until I found this town. Not until I found you." Beatrice felt tears prickling behind her eyes. "I'm glad," she whispered. "I can't imagine Riverstone without you now." Harrison's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. Beatrice answered by leaning forward slightly, giving permission. His kiss was gentle, almost reverent, a first kiss between two people who had known loss and understood the precious fragility of connection. When they parted, Beatrice felt a strange mixture of emotions, joy and guilt, excitement and fear. Harrison seemed to understand without words, pulling her close so her head rested against his shoulder. "We take this as slowly as you need," he murmured into her hair. "There's no rush, Beatrice." They remained on the plateau until the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley. The ride back to town was filled with a new awareness between them, something precious and tentative taking shape. At her door, Harrison kissed her once more, briefly but with a promise of more to come. "I'll see you next Sunday," he said, his voice husky. "So long?" Beatrice asked before she could stop herself. Harrison smiled, clearly pleased by her disappointment. "Coleman's got me breaking a new stallion this week, demanding work." His expression softened. "But I'll be counting the days." That night, Beatrice sat at her small writing desk and opened the journal Harrison had given her. She had been using it to record her thoughts as she navigated her grief and the unexpected new feelings blossoming within her. Tonight's entry came from a heart both confused and hopeful. "I kissed a man who was not my husband today. The guilt I expected to feel was there, but dimmer than the joy. Is this betrayal, Thomas? Or is it what you would have wanted for me to find happiness again? Harrison understands loss in a way few can. Perhaps that's why my heart recognizes something in him. Something like home." The week dragged by with excruciating slowness. Beatrice threw herself into work at the store, rearranging the new book section and ordering additional titles from a catalog a traveling salesman had left with her. On Thursday, a package arrived from Denver, books she'd ordered specifically based on conversations with Harrison about authors they both enjoyed. As she unpacked the volumes, the bell above the door chimed, looking up with a smile that quickly faded. Beatrice found herself facing three men she didn't recognize, trail-worn and rough-looking, with the hard eyes of those who lived outside the bounds of civilized society. "Afternoon, madam," the tallest of the three said, his gaze traveling around the store in a way that made Beatrice instinctively step back. "Fine establishment you have here." "Thank you," Beatrice replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "How may I help you gentlemen today?" The men spread out, moving between the shelves with a casualness that felt calculated. "Just passing through," the man continued, looking to resupply before heading north. "Of course," Beatrice said, moving behind the counter where Thomas had always kept a shotgun. "I have all the usual trail supplies: coffee, beans, bacon, ammunition." The second man, shorter but broader than the first, picked up a tin of peaches, examining it before setting it down carelessly. "Heard this town's got a new horse trainer at the Coleman place, fella named Lawson." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat at Harrison's name. "Mr. Coleman has several employees," she said carefully. "I wouldn't know all of them." The third man, who had been silent until now, laughed a harsh sound with no humor. "That's not what we heard, lady. Word is you and Lawson are quite friendly." Fear trickled down Beatrice's spine. "I don't see how my acquaintances are any business of yours," she said, her hand inching toward the shelf where the shotgun lay hidden. The first man approached the counter, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Well, you see, we have some unfinished business with Lawson from a few years back. Thought you might know when we could find him in town." Before Beatrice could respond, the door opened again, and Sheriff Daniel Morris entered, his weathered face hardening at the sight of the strangers. "Afternoon, Mrs. Sutton," he said, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "These men giving you any trouble?" The tension in the store was palpable as the three men exchanged glances. Finally, the leader shook his head. "No trouble, Sheriff. Just looking to buy supplies." "Then I suggest you make your purchases and move on," Morris replied. "Riverstone's a peaceful town. We aim to keep it that way." The men made a show of buying minimal supplies, just enough to justify their presence in the store. As they paid, the leader leaned slightly over the counter. "Tell Lawson that Garrett sends his regards," he murmured, quiet enough that the sheriff couldn't hear. "We'll be seeing him real soon." After they left, Sheriff Morris lingered, his expression concerned. "You all right, Mrs. Sutton?" Those men didn't seem like ordinary travelers. Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she closed the cash drawer. "They were asking about Mr. Lawson at the Coleman Ranch." Morris frowned. "That's so? Any particular reason?" "They mentioned unfinished business," Beatrice replied. "And the leader, I think his name is Garrett, wanted Harrison to know they'd be seeing him soon." The sheriff's frown deepened. "I'll keep an eye on them while they're in town. and maybe ride out to Coleman's place tomorrow to give Lawson a heads up. After the sheriff left, Beatrice closed the store early, her mind racing with worry. Who were those men? And what did they want with Harrison? The mention of unfinished business suggested a past connection one Harrison had never mentioned. She paced her apartment that evening, debating whether to send word to the Coleman ranch. Before she could decide, a knock at her door startled her. Heart pounding, Beatrice approached cautiously. "Who is it?" she called. "It's me," Harrison's familiar voice replied. Relief flooded through her as she unlocked the door. Harrison stood on her threshold, his expression grim. "Sheriff Morris found me at the ranch," he said without preamble. "Told me about your visitors." Beatrice pulled him inside, locking the door behind him. "Harrison, who are they? What do they want with you?" Harrison ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure visibly shaken. "They're trouble from my past, Beatrice. Men I hoped never to see again." "Tell me," she urged, leading him to sit on the settee. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with himself. "Remember, I told you I've worked ranches across 4 territories?" When Beatrice nodded, he continued, "What I didn't tell you is that not all of it was honest work. After Catherine and Henry died, I fell in with some rough men for a time. Men who didn't always respect property lines when it came to cattle." Beatrice's eyes widened. "You were a rustler?" "For about a year," Harrison admitted, shame evident in his voice. "I was angry at the world, at God. Didn't much care what happened to me." He looked down at his hands. "Garrett Davis led the gang. We worked the Wyoming-Montana border, taking cattle from the big outfits, selling them in small batches to homesteaders who didn't ask questions." "What happened?" Beatrice asked softly. "There was a raid that went wrong. A young ranch hand couldn't have been more than 17 tried to stop us. Garrett shot him." Harrison's voice broke slightly. "The boy died in my arms while the others made off with the cattle. That night, I took my share of the money, left it with the ranch as anonymous restitution, and rode away. Never looked back." Beatrice processed this revelation, trying to reconcile the honorable man she knew with the outlaw he described. "And now, Garrett has found you?" Harrison nodded grimly. "Appears that way. He probably thinks I still have money from those days, or that I owe him something for leaving." His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Beatrice. I should have told you everything before now." "Yes, you should have," she agreed, hurt mingling with concern. "But that doesn't change how I feel about you, Harrison. We all have pasts we're not proud of." Relief washed over his features. "You're more forgiving than I deserve." "What will you do now?" Beatrice asked. "Sheriff Morris said they're still in town." Harrison's expression hardened. "I need to face them. End this once and for all." "That sounds dangerous," Beatrice protested. "Why not let the sheriff handle it?" "Morris is a good man, but this is my problem," Harrison insisted. "These men won't stop until they find me. And I won't have them threatening you to get to me." Beatrice reached for his hand. "Then we'll face them together." Harrison shook his head firmly. "No, I want you to stay away from the store tomorrow. Go visit Margaret Coleman at the ranch. I'll send word when it's safe to return." They argued long into the night, Beatrice refusing to hide while Harrison put himself in danger. Harrison equally adamant that she remains safe. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Beatrice would open the store as usual, but at the first sign of trouble, she would go directly to the sheriff's office. Harrison left before dawn, pressing a lingering kiss to her lips at the door. "No matter what happens today," he said quietly, "know that meeting you has been the greatest blessing of my life." The words filled Beatrice with both warmth and dread. "This isn't goodbye, Harrison Lawson," she said firmly. "I'll see you this evening." Morning brought a strange tension to Riverstone. Word had spread about the strangers asking questions, and the normally bustling Main Street was unusually quiet. Beatrice opened the store at 8 as always, though few customers ventured in. By noon, her nerves were stretched thin with waiting. The bell above the door jangled harshly, causing Beatrice to jump. Sheriff Morris entered, his expression serious. "Mrs. Sutton, I think you should close up and come with me. There's trouble brewing at the saloon." "Harrison?" she asked, already reaching for her shawl. "He rode in about an hour ago," Morris confirmed. "Those men are there too. Words have been exchanged. They hurried down the street toward the Riverstone Saloon, where a small crowd had gathered outside. As they approached, the Batwing doors burst open, and Harrison stumbled out, followed by Garrett Davis. Both men were disheveled, evidence of a physical altercation clear on their faces. "You owe me." "Lawson!" Garrett shouted, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. "That money was mine by rights." Harrison straightened, wiping blood from a split lip. "I don't owe you anything, Garrett. That money went to the family of the boy you murdered." "Murdered?" Garrett laughed coldly. "That was business, and you were just as guilty you rode with us." "I made my peace with that family," Harrison replied steadily. "I've spent years trying to make amends for the man I was then." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Well, I aim to collect what's mine, one way or another." The tension crackled between them. The crowd backing away as both men stood poised for violence. Beatrice pushed forward, ignoring Sheriff Morris's attempt to hold her back. "Harrison!" she called, drawing both men's attention. Harrison's eyes widened in alarm. "Beatrice, get back!" Garrett's gaze shifted to her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "So, this is the widow I've heard about. Pretty little thing." His hand moved to his gun. "Wonder how much she means to you, Lawson." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Garrett drew his weapon, pointing it not at Harrison, but at Beatrice. Harrison lunged forward with a roar of rage just as Sheriff Morris drew his own gun. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, echoing off the buildings of Main Street. Garrett crumpled to the ground, a look of surprise frozen on his face as blood bloomed across his chest. Harrison staggered backward, clutching his side, before dropping to one knee. "Harrison!" Beatrice screamed, rushing to his side. Blood seeped between his fingers where he pressed them against his abdomen. "It's not bad," he gasped, though his ashen face suggested otherwise. "Just a graze." Sheriff Morris knelt beside Garrett, checking for signs of life before shaking his head grimly. He rose and approached Harrison. "Let's get you to Doc Wilson," he said, helping Beatrice support Harrison's weight as they made their way to the doctor's house at the end of the street. The next hours passed in a blur of fear and waiting. Dr. Wilson extracted the bullet from Harrison's side, declaring him fortunate the shot had missed vital organs but caused significant blood loss. Beatrice refused to leave his side, maintaining a vigil as he drifted in and out of consciousness through the afternoon and evening. As night fell, Dr. Wilson insisted Beatrice get some rest. "He's stable now," the doctor assured her. "The worst has passed." Reluctantly, Beatrice returned to her apartment above the store, though sleep eluded her. She sat by the window until dawn, watching the street below gradually come to life as the town awakened. As soon as it was reasonable, she hurried back to the doctor's house. Harrison was awake, propped against pillows, his face pale but alert. His eyes brightened when she entered. "There you are," he said softly. "I was afraid yesterday might have changed your mind about me." Beatrice crossed to his bedside, taking his hand in both of hers. "It would take more than learning you have a past to change my heart, Harrison Lawson." "Even a past that includes riding with outlaws?" he asked, searching her face. "You made mistakes," Beatrice acknowledged, "but you also made amends. The man I know, the man I love, is honorable and kind." Harrison's eyes widened at her declaration. "You love me?" Beatrice smiled, suddenly certain. "Yes, I do. It surprised me too." Harrison reached up to touch her cheek, his hand trembling slightly from weakness. "I love you, Beatrice Sutton. Have since that day by the creek when you told me about your dreams for the bookshop." They sat together as morning sunlight streamed through the window, talking of the future in ways neither had dared before. Harrison's companions had fled town after Garrett's death, removing the immediate threat to their peace. "What happens now?" Beatrice asked eventually. Sheriff Morris said he'd need to file a report about what happened. Harrison nodded soberly. "I'll have to be honest about my past. There may be consequences. Whatever comes," Beatrice promised, "we'll face it together." The consequences, when they came, were less severe than either had feared. Harrison's years of honest work and the circumstances of the confrontation, with multiple witnesses testifying that Garrett had drawn first and aimed at Beatrice, weighed in his favor. The The territorial judge who reviewed the case ordered Harrison to pay a fine for his past association with the rustlers, but filed no charges related to Garrett's death, ruling it self-defense. By the time autumn painted the mountains with gold and crimson, Harrison had recovered fully and returned to his work at the Coleman Ranch. He rode into town more frequently now, often staying in Riverstone overnight rather than making the journey back to the ranch in darkness. On a crisp October evening, Harrison escorted Beatrice to dinner at the Coleman's ranch house, an invitation Margaret had extended weeks earlier. As they rode back toward town under a canopy of stars, Harrison suggested they stop at their spot overlooking the valley. "It's getting cold," Beatrice protested mildly. "And late." "Just for a moment," Harrison insisted, helping her dismount when they reached the plateau. The valley below was dark except for the twinkling lights of Riverstone, a small island of humanity in the vast wilderness. The moon hung full and bright above them, casting everything in silver light. Harrison took both her hands in his expression serious in the moonlight. "Beatrice, when I first saw you in that cemetery, I recognized something in you that called to the broken places in me. You were trying so hard to be strong while falling apart inside." Beatrice squeezed his hands, remembering that day with perfect clarity. "You said you saw me, that you chose me." "I did," Harrison nodded, "and every day since has only confirmed what I somehow knew then, that you were meant to be in my life." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that glinted in the moonlight. "I'm asking you to choose me too, for all our days to come." The ring was simple but beautiful, a gold band with a single small diamond that caught the moonlight. Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes as Harrison dropped to one knee before her. "Beatrice Sutton, will you marry me?" For a moment, Beatrice thought of Thomas, of the promises they had made, the life they had planned. But with that thought came a certainty that he would have wanted this for her. Happiness, love, a second chance. "Yes," she whispered, her voice growing stronger as she repeated, "Yes, Harrison, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, Beatrice felt the final pieces of her heart knitting back together, not erasing the scars of loss, but incorporating them into something new and equally precious. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small white church at the end of Main Street. Margaret Coleman had helped Beatrice select fabric for a new dress, deep blue velvet, that complemented her eyes and symbolized her final step away from widow's weeds. Harrison wore a new black suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, even Eleanor Porter, who had finally softened her stance after witnessing Harrison's devotion during his recovery. Reverend Walsh spoke of new beginnings and the courage it takes to open one's heart after lost words that brought tears to both bride and groom. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the town hall, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the holiday. As music played and townsfolk danced, Harrison led Beatrice outside for a moment of quiet beneath the star-filled sky. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "More than I ever thought possible again," Beatrice replied honestly. "Though I keep expecting to wake up and find this has all been a dream." Harrison kissed her tenderly. "No dream, just a second chance neither of us expected to find." They returned to the celebration hand in hand, both aware of how far they had come from that first meeting in the cemetery. As midnight approached, William Coleman called for attention, raising his glass in a toast. "To Harrison and Beatrice," he proclaimed, "may your future be as bright as the love we all see between you." The crowd echoed the sentiment, glasses raised high. In that moment, surrounded by the community that had become her family, Beatrice felt a sense of belonging she'd feared lost forever. Harrison's arm around her waist, his ring on her finger, and the promise of tomorrow in his eyes, all of it felt like a miracle born from the ashes of grief. Later that night, as snow began to fall gently outside the window of the hotel room the town had gifted them for their wedding night, Harrison and Beatrice lay tangled together, the physical expression of their love as tender and healing as everything that had come before. "I never thought I'd find this again," Harrison murmured against her hair. "A home, a heart to call my own." "Nor did I," Beatrice replied, her fingers tracing the scar on his side, a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing their chance. But here we are, Harrison agreed, drawing her closer. And here we'll stay. Spring arrived with a burst of new life across the Montana Territory. The mountains shed their snowy mantles, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and Beatrice Lawson discovered she was carrying a child news that filled both her and Harrison with equal parts joy and trepidation, given their past losses. They had settled into a new rhythm of life together. Harrison had built a small house on land adjacent to the Coleman Ranch, allowing him to continue his work with the horses while being close enough to town for Beatrice to maintain the store, which she had officially renamed Sutton and Lawson General Goods and Bookshop. The expanded book section had proven surprisingly popular, with orders coming in from homesteaders throughout the area. On a warm May evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home watching the sunset paint the mountains, Harrison placed his hand gently over the slight swell of Beatrice's abdomen. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. "After Henry, I never thought I'd risk loving a child again." Beatrice covered his hand with her own. "I know. I'm frightened too. But we can't let fear rob us of joy, Harrison." He nodded, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You're right, and this child will have something neither of us had after our losses, someone who truly understands." As summer bloomed across the valley, so did Beatrice, her body changing to accommodate the new life within. Harrison became increasingly protective, riding with her to and from town each day, insisting she hire help at the store to manage the heavier work. The town embraced the coming baby with enthusiasm, particularly Margaret Coleman, who organized a gathering where the women of Riverstone presented handmade gifts for the child. Tiny clothes, blankets, a beautifully carved wooden cradle from William Coleman himself. "This community," Beatrice said to Harrison that night as they arranged the gifts in the small room they had prepared as a nursery, "it's something I never expected when Thomas and I first arrived here." "Riverstone has a way of claiming people," Harrison agreed, running his hand over the smooth wood of the cradle, "making them its own." In late October, as the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, Beatrice went into labor. Harrison rode for Dr. Beulah Wilson, while Margaret Coleman, who had become like family to them both, stayed at Beatrice's side. The labor was long and difficult, testing Beatrice's strength and Harrison's faith as hours stretched into a day, then into night again. Outside their bedroom window, the first significant snowfall of the season began, blanketing the world in white as Beatrice fought to bring their child into the world. "You can do this," Harrison whispered, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Beatrice." Just as dawn broke on the second day, their daughter arrived with a lusty cry that filled the room and their hearts. Dr. Wilson placed the tiny red-faced infant on Beatrice's chest, where small fists waved in indignation at the cold world she had entered. "She's perfect," Beatrice breathed, counting fingers and toes through tears of exhaustion and joy. Harrison sat beside them on the bed, one large finger caught in his daughter's surprisingly strong grip. "What shall we call her?" he asked, voice thick with emotion. Beatrice looked up at him, love overwhelming her. "I was thinking Catherine Hope Lawson." Harrison's eyes filled with tears. "Catherine," he repeated softly, "a way of honoring the past while looking to the future." As the years passed, Catherine, called Cat by her father, from the moment she took her first steps, was joined by a brother, Thomas Henry, and later by another sister, Eleanor Margaret. The Lawson home, once a simple structure, expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Harrison adding rooms as needed, always with a book-lined study for Beatrice at the heart of the house. The bookshop portion of the store flourished, eventually taking over the entire building as Beatrice hired Robert Miller, Sarah's son, to open a separate general store next door. Harrison continued his work with horses, his reputation spreading throughout the territory, bringing clients from as far as Denver, seeking his expertise in training and breeding. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Harrison took Beatrice back to the cemetery, where he had found her weeping in the shadows. Together, they placed flowers on Thomas's grave, now bearing a proper headstone, rather than the wooden cross. "I wonder sometimes," Beatrice said softly, "what he would think of the life we've built." Harrison wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I think he'd be proud of you, of how you've honored his memory while finding the courage to create something new." Beatrice leaned into her husband's embrace, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from two broken souls hiding from life to partners building a future neither had dared to imagine possible. "I see you," Harrison whispered against her hair, echoing the words that had changed both their lives a decade earlier. "I choose you, today and always." "Today and always," Beatrice repeated, turning in his arms to face the man who had taught her that love wasn't a finite resource, but an ever-expanding miracle. "I choose you too." As they walked hand in hand from the cemetery toward home, where their children waited with Margaret Coleman for the celebration dinner she had helped prepare, Beatrice felt the full circle of their journey, from shadows into light, from grief into joy, from two separate paths of loss converging into one road traveled together. The sun was setting over Riverstone, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, promising another tomorrow for a love that had begun in the unlikeliest of places. A quiet graveyard where a widow wept and a cowboy saw beyond her tears to the woman waiting to be found.